Hey everybody, thanks for listening. This is Aaron. This episode we had some audio difficulties on Eleanor's side, and I tried my best to fix that and make it sound good. And I think it sounds pretty good. So if you hear her cutting in and out, that's what happened. I also, we both have young children, so she had her daughter with her during the interview, and I had to prepare breakfast for my children while I was talking to her. So the very strange noises you will hear are me opening the oven and putting on oven mitts and taking out an egg bake. So that's what that noise is. I apologize for all that, so hope you enjoy the episode anyway. It was a lot of fun. Happy Halloween. Thank you. Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. I am your host, Aaron Erber. This is a podcast about stories, myths, and the Catholic faith. Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. Today is a bonus episode for Halloween, and I wanted to talk about vampires and Dracula. And I have with me to talk about Dracula, vampires, and her own books is Eleanor Bourg Nicholson. And I'm going to let Eleanor introduce herself.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I have 2 Gothic novels. And a teacher of Victorian literature for Homeschool Connections. And I have 5 small children, which, as we were discussing before we started recording, totally qualifies me to talk about monsters. Wonderful monsters, but monsters in need of grace. Very much in need of grace.
Yeah, they're misunderstood monsters. They're the only
Yes.
Misunderstood monsters.
Yes.
We can talk about like modern tropes and how like monsters have been kind of turned into, your friend kind of, but yeah, so I wanted to talk about vampires, and I was doing a lot of research yesterday, mostly just through Wikipedia and reading Dracula, about vampires. And I read your book, A Bloody Habit, about a year ago. And I know there's no visual, there's no visual component, but I love the cover. It's your priest, Father Gilroy, is that his name?
Yeah, Father Thomas Edmund Gilroy.
Yeah, and he's got this blood-stained habit with a giant stake, and he just looks so serene. It's fantastic. Yeah, so did you say you had a story about the cover?
So the cover, the illustration on the cover is by a very, very talented liturgical artist named Matthew Alderman, and he's an old friend of mine, and I said, I want an illustration of this character. And he said, sure, I'll do that. And I said, in an iconographic style, because Matt produces saint icons. So he produced it for me, and it's very large, and it's hanging in my kitchen.
Awesome.
And I can't tell you how many people come in, and because we're Catholic, they sort of take it in stride and don't even notice that there's a vampire slayer with a bloody stake.
It's normal. It's Catholic.
A friend of ours, I showed it to a friend, a professor, who sent it to another academic, a Dominican academic, and said, can you name this Dominican friar? Well, then it ended up on a high scholarly website, the New Liturgical Movement website, and they were all analyzing the picture, and Matt, the artist, contacted me and said, why is that being analyzed on the by all these scholars who can't identify it because it's a character in a novel? And I said, I didn't do it. Get it down. I didn't do it. It was a prank, and it wasn't my prank.
That's amazing.
But he does, and he captures, like you said, the blood and gore of vampire slaying, or what we perceive as vampire slaying, but his perfect serenity, which is why Father Thomas Edmund is the ultimate vampire slayer. He's just not upset about vampires. He can make the Eucharist every day. What's the big deal?
Right, yeah. And it's really, in the book, so we can get to that, but so why? Why did you write this book? I mean, I'm happy you did, and I think more should be written that like this, because it's part of my part of my podcast is talking about, Catholic science fiction and fantasy authors. So you and I had Sandra Measle on, and she talked about all, a whole slew of, and she actually name dropped you. And she said she enjoyed your book. So, and so that was nice. And she talked about a whole slew of Catholic authors that she personally knew. And I think we need to bring more attention to it. But why? So why? Why'd you write this?
Well, it's a topic that interests me very much. I enjoy classic Gothic. I don't read modern horror. I enjoy classic Gothic. And one of the common tropes that you see in classic Gothic is the introduction of Catholic, aestheticized, appropriated things, themes, figures. And this is because the Gothic is supposed to capture something beyond the natural world, something beyond what empirical science and the Enlightenment have shown us. Mm-hmm. Saying we want something more. That's what attracted people to the Gothic. That's where the Gothic came from, as a reaction to the hyper-rational. Mm-hmm. All that is what you see before you.
Right.
And it can be analyzed according to scientific method. Then you had writers in the Romantic era and a little bit before saying, no, there are nightmares. There are so many things beyond that we can't capture. And of course, as a Catholic, I'd say they were reaching for the supernatural via the preternatural. Mm-hmm. But they're also just looking at, the human psyche. So when you have a character or a reader who encounters the otherness of outer space or the otherness of Gothic or mm-hmm. the otherness of any sort of fantasy, they're being brought outside themselves in a really interesting way. And of course, the ultimate goal is that the character or the reader will be able to stop and reflect on himself. Mm-hmm. So, you encounter the other and you say, my goodness, it's a mirror. It might be a funhouse mirror, but it's still a bit of a mirror into the human souls. Mm-hmm. And when you get into a Gothic novel, because of this, you can get away with talking about life and death and damnation and redemption. You can't do that in many literary genres today. Yeah. You can totally get away with it in the Gothic, though.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's something I said in my first episode. The fantasy genre, the romantic genre, is the last place where you can take these sorts of things seriously. Where the reader actually will read it, and they might actually reflect on the supernatural or any of these things, these crazy things that we Catholics believe.
Well, and add to that the fact that it's so commonly, like I said, the anti-Catholic trope. It's especially in the British tradition. Yeah. You'll have people with extreme anxiety about things Catholic. But how are you going to convey that otherness, the supernatural? Mm-hmm. You're not going to have your Protestant pastor walk through. You're going to have a glowering Jesuit or a scheming nun or something like that, which captures something that has something metaphysical, something supernatural, something sacramental. All these things that have been dismissed. That's going to be what captures it for you, which is why in my novels, hopefully we'll discuss a bit, for the narrator protagonist, it's the question, which is scarier, vampires or the papists?
You're right. Yeah, and that's something that's in Dracula as well by Stoker, where you have these, and full disclosure, I haven't finished it, but I'm about a third of the way through. You have these like Romanian, Eastern European peasants who, the English Jonathan Harker, that's his name, right? Jonathan Harker.
Yep.
And he's there, he's Count Dracula's lawyer, and all of these like Eastern European peasants are like, oh, don't go to that castle, it's evil, and they give him all these they give him a rosary, and they all of these like things to ward off evil, and he's like, what is going on? Like, this is all a bunch of nonsense, but they're also sincere about it. He feels really bad, So, but
notice what he does in the castle then. When he's getting scared out of his mind, there's this wonderful moment where he's holding the rosary, which half the time is described as a rosary and half the time is described as a crucifix, because Bram Stoker sort of throws things in without being clear.
Right.
But he holds it and he says, how is it that this thing I have been brought up to consider superstitious gives me consolation?
Right.
Is it just sort of association, or is there something in this thing that consoles me, that has some sort of power?
Right.
And he says, I shall think of this sometime. And not to give away anything, he doesn't.
Right. Oh man, yeah, it's really fun to read. To read that and just the crazy stuff that happens in the castle when he's slowly figuring out that Count Dracula is a monster, and the only thing that stops Dracula is the crucifix at one moment when he's shaving. So he nicks himself and there's some blood, and then Dracula goes to lunge for him and he has the crucifix, and he doesn't ever seem to really connect those things, or he doesn't want to, which is very English Protestant. He doesn't want to doesn't want to think about the papists.
Well, and it'll challenge everything in his life, and later on you'll reach a point where Van Helsing actually will take a consecrated host and mash it into putty.
I know that. Right.
Well, it's a very famous moment, but as you know from reading Bloody Habit, it's nonsense.
Right.
The entire, if you materially alter the substance, first of all, that's blasphemous.
Right, it's a sacrilege.
Second of all, it's no longer efficacious. So but he says something that I find so uproariously funny. Every time he says, I have an indulgence.
Right.
Technically, he would need a dispensation.
Right.
He wouldn't get one. But the indulgences are one of these things that the English Protestants think the Catholic Church gives out.
Right.
Oh, you get an indulgence, that means that you can manipulate the Eucharist and commit sacrilege.
Yeah, you can just do whatever you want.
Exactly. And he probably paid for it, too.
Yeah, no, it's really funny.
And notice, too, he imports the Eucharist. There were Catholics in England at this time,
right.
But he has to import it from Holland.
Right, yeah. It's a special one. I don't know. It's one that can be turned into putty.
Well, it's because the English want Catholics like Dracula to be from those foreign places. They're not from here.
Right, yeah, exactly. There are no Catholics here. No, this is all from Eastern Europe, This is some Eastern Europe thing. So, yeah, that kind of leads me to your book, A Bloody Habit. So, with these like quasi-Catholic themes in Dracula, I mean, they're Catholic themes, but they get some kind of wrong. What I liked about your book is that you actually the book Dracula plays a huge role in your book, where you're constantly referencing it, and the main character is he's like the first few chapters, he's like reading it on a train. He's this is just a bunch of rubbish. It's a bunch of junk, but he's still reading it. He's still like he can't stop reading it, which I thought was hilarious. And then he, if you want to just speak to that, how does like Dracula in your book kind of go back and forth?
Well, there are. Dracula is itself such an extraordinary novel, and it's been so popular. Some people have suggested, I don't know that I've ever seen the data to prove it, but that it's outsold the Bible. I don't know. But there was an early reviewer, and I'm totally going to paraphrase this, but it's a wonderful, wonderful statement. He says something about how bad it is. It's a train wreck of a novel. But at the end, he says, I defy any scoffing reader to read it late at night. You will start, pulling up your shirt sleeve. I'm sorry. Right. As you know, Aaron, I'm holding a 5-month-old, and she's just going to blow raspberries.
No, that's all right.
So Esther says, hello, everyone. And that's not a coincidence, or it is a coincidence that she has the same name as the heroine of A Bloody Habit. So
it is a coincidence.
Book, she's going to say, Mommy, why did you name me after this female? In any case, Dracula as a novel, even if you're reading it and laughing at the unintentional hilarity of it, and just the exuberant Irishman telling a great yarn, there's something there. It creeps you out. It creeps you out, and it gets under your skin. But one of my favorite parts about Dracula, or aspects of Dracula, is the fact that in writing it, Bram Stoker was going back to vampire folklore. Yeah. Because you really have two traditions of vampires. You have the folklore tradition, which emerges after the Enlightenment. Yeah, that's my big newsflash for today. The waves of vampire hysteria came after the Enlightenment. Yeah. They did not happen in the Middle Ages.
And I want to talk more about that. But yeah, keep going.
Well, and but then when you have the rise of the Gothic, through the Romantics, you get the sexy vampire image. It starts with Polidori and Lord Byron. Yeah. And that's where, the extreme heritage is the really, really, really boring Novocaine-ridden vampires of Twilight or the Vampire Chronicles.
No.
Predators aren't sexy.
Right.
That's another newsflash. Predators aren't sexy. They're evil. Very, very bad themes to introduce to young women. So you've got the sexy aristocratic tradition, and then you've got the vampire folklore where Dracula has bad breath.
Yeah.
Long white mustaches and bad breath, and long fingernails and hair on his palms.
Yeah, what's with the hair on the palms? What's with that?
It's supposed to just represent, basically, he's close to being a beast.
Okay.
So there is a kinship with the beasts. We're not going to talk about werewolves, but he does control werewolves. Yeah,
so he's got this relationship with the wolves around his castle where he can control them. And when he has hair, I'm like, the hair on his palms, like what? See.
Well, and he does that lizard scene where he climbs head first down the side of the castle.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. That's one of the scenes where it's just weird. It's grotesque.
I know. The weirdness of it it's really, it's fun. And he's got the cape billowing around him as he's crawling down. It's really dramatic. That's what I love about it. It's so like just over the top. It's just fantastic. And I didn't think I'd like it this much. It was,
and this is where I think Bram Stoker, his day job was, he was the manager of the Lyceum Theater, and the famous Henry Irving, one of the most famous actors of the period, very dramatic actor. Some have suggested that Stoker based some of the aspects of Dracula on the appearance of Irving himself. Irving said that Dracula was, what did he call it? Trash? Something very cutting, cutting. So Irving was not impressed with Dracula. But that sense of stage, and you get a lot of moments in the novel where you feel like Bram Stoker is saying, and now the cast of thousands, I even brought in an American.
Yeah, right.
Onto the stage. It's,
right.
You need a very swelling song. He's got theater down, does Bram Stoker.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very dramatic. You can tell that he worked in the theater. But yeah, so this folklore tradition. So yeah, and I think Dracula kind of combines the folklore with the sexy tradition, the sexy tradition, whatever. And with Count Dracula he's very smooth, he's very suave, but he also is, you can't get too close to him because his breath does stink. And he's got a gross long mustache, and he's very different from like the Bela Lugosi, rendition.
Yes.
Bela Lugosi, I don't know where that came from, but he's got like the slick back hair and the big, cape with the hood, and
totally Byron. It's totally the Byronic romantic tradition. He's smooth, he's suave.
Yeah.
But here's a really big difference between the two, which is weird to me and fascinating. In the book, one of the scariest aspects of Dracula is that he can speak English without much accent.
Yeah. He wants to blend in.
Van Helsing show up. You can't understand half of what Van Helsing says. Have you gotten to the King Laugh passage?
No, not yet.
Where when you get to that passage, if you're listening on an audiobook, the first time I'd already read the book, I was listening on an audiobook, and I went, wait, what? Where? I had to go back and go, oh, it's that King Laugh thing. That's what he's talking about, because what are you doing, Van Helsing? So Dracula speaks without an accent. Bela Lugosi, of course, I want to suck your blood.
Yeah, right. It's very, well, that's what Dracula wanted. He wanted to be able to blend in with English society and no one would know he's a foreigner. He was really good at it too. Like and Jonathan Harker kept saying, your English is great. It's almost better than mine,
And I think he even says, hey, if I make a mistake, correct me.
Right, yeah.
My grammar's off. If I use an expression wrong, tell me.
Right.
And I think, too, this brings us to something that Stoker, he sticks in it's very small, but Van Helsing at one point says London is the place of most promise for him.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is even if they're superstitious, but those Catholic peasants in Romania know how to respond to a vampire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
The Englishman, he doesn't exist. He can't exist because empirical science, and we're not papists.
Everybody's so rational. Yeah, this can't possibly exist. We're all the peasants, they know he's a vampire. They know he's evil, right? And so they have don't go to the castle. They have these crucifixes and all of their, like wards and stuff like that. Yeah. So in this like folkloric tradition, I was reading up on it last night, and there's a lot of stuff. Vampires are in like every single culture, or some sort of vampire creature is in every culture. Even down there's the chupacabra down in Mexico, which isn't. People lump it in with vampires, and it's kind of similar. But then there's like the Lamia in like Greece. You have all of these. Yeah. Like, so what's going on there? Like, why?
I think there is in man a preoccupation with blood because it is, as Renfield says. Renfield, by the way, might be my favorite character in Dracula. Mm-hmm. It is the life. It runs through the human body. It also represents the progression of generations. Yeah. It represents one's race. It represents so many things, and you don't want it spilled. Right. So it's a huge threat to think of something that is, number one, going to suck your blood, but number two, going to complicate one's passage into the afterlife. So there's concern about dead bodies. What happens with the dead body? There's that wonderful line that Father Thomas Edmund Gilroy quotes from the Summa. Yeah. Hilarious line. A man would feel, I think it says uncomfortable, untoward were to happen to his body after death.
Yeah. I have it here. As Aquinas himself noted in his Summa, Part 3, Question 71, Article 2, in reply to Objection 3, the Summa's fun. Hence, in accordance with this natural affection for his own flesh, a man has during life a certain solicitude for what will become of his body after death, and he would grieve if he had a presentiment that something untoward would happen to his body.
Exactly. And when you read that, you say, wait, what?
Yeah, untoward.
Fabulous. Like, thank you, Aquinas. You wouldn't have read my book, but you certainly, and his anthropological, his hierarchy of the demonic, was extremely useful, to me. But no, it's so I think that's part of it for each culture. Anxiety about death, anxiety and fascination with blood and what it represents. Yeah. And when you come up with monsters, you want monsters that strike at something that is at the heart of man. Right. So it is this undead creature that can prey upon you. Right. But also the whole question that Stoker never resolves is the question of complicity for the victim. Are some of these victims complicit? If they aren't complicit, how is it that they can be turned into vampires? To what degree as vampires are they damned? Right. So this is something Stoker it's very messy. It's very messy in Stoker. Yeah. Hopefully less messy for me. But for the context of this, Stoker himself, people have always, or for many years, have considered that Stoker was just sort of throwing stuff together. No, the man researched. He researched for 7 years. We have his notes. If you want to have a really awesome time, read Stoker's notes in preparation for Dracula into folklore. The original draft of the novel included a Last Supper scene with Dracula presiding over the Last Supper. So the Eucharistic elements in this novel are deliberate. Yeah. Everything he's putting in there, the use of garlic, which, by the way, the reason that has power over vampires is it smells worse than vampires. Really? So there's all the tools used against vampires either have a connection in the Christian tradition to Christ, or in the folklore tradition have something to say about the decaying body and what to do with the decaying body.
Well, with garlic, I had read somewhere, and I don't know where, that they don't like garlic because it reminds them of the fires of hell, and that's why they don't. Yep. That's why they don't like it. Which I always thought was super cool. It's the same with Santa Claus leaving a lump of coal is to remind bad children of hell, the pains of hell that await them unless they amend their life. And I didn't know that until a few months ago, and I'm like, Santa's awesome. Santa Claus is fantastic. That's amazing.
When you really get into this stuff, like same stories, they can be pretty phenomenal and much richer than we anticipate. Yeah. But that's why I love folklore tradition, and the rules, non-rules, puts me in mind of many years ago. I found a board game called The Fury of Dracula. Oh, yeah. I gave it to my baby brother. And whether you're a good guy or a bad guy, right? Yeah, Dracula or the others. Sorry, more raspberries. Whether you're fighting at night, whether you're fighting during the day, Dracula's powers, which of his powers he can use. These are things that Stoker was taking notes on.
Yeah.
He's not necessarily consistent, but he had a list of rules, and sometimes he almost followed them.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell in Dracula that he really was taking it seriously. You know, it wasn't for the sake of drama, he took it seriously at least. You know, because in a lot of novels you can tell when the author doesn't really care. You know, or so you can tell Stoker actually cared, even if he got some things wrong. But yeah, so with the lore, I was reading. So there's this kind of difference between the suave, sexy vampire being gaunt and thin, and then the folklore vampire after engorging blood. And Dracula kind of has this in there. He's engorged and, you know, ruddy looking, and blood is like leaking out of the mouth and stuff. And so
like a giant leech.
Like a leech, yeah. And have you ever read George MacDonald's Lilith?
Yes.
Yeah. So Lilith is depicted as a vampire, almost like as a leech. And that's a good book too.
So across the Victorian period, there was fascination with vampires. There were a lot of vampire novels across the Victorian period. Most of them are really bad. But a lot of writers and artists were interested in the character of Lilith, a figure of Lilith. Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the Raphaelites, definitely, which speaks to your interest in Catholic writers who are dealing with vampires or the preternatural.
Yeah.
Which, of course, we have to talk about Tim Powers, who is he's the king of the preternatural, supernatural. And in Hiding from Among the Graves, he has Rossetti facing off with the vampire.
Right. Tim Powers is one of my favorite authors. And I have not read Stress of Her Regard, but I have read Hide Me Among the Graves. And yeah, he deals with basically both books have to do with the Romantics, all of the Romantic poets, artists, and I don't know if the pre-Raphaelites, do they count as Romantics? Is that...
They were following on the heels of the Romantics, so they're drawing very heavily from the Romantics.
Okay. Yeah.
But it is a different movement about 30 years later.
Yeah.
But it's very compelling, and I've spent a lot of time working on the pre-Raphaelites. When Tim Powers gets into something, it just makes so much sense.
I know
it's fiction, but
you want it to be real because it's so detailed, and it's like this is a cooler explanation than anything else. Like I want this to be true, even though it would mean vampires and demons. You know, demons are real, but vampires and genies and stuff are real. But yeah, so finally someone else brings up Tim Powers. I didn't bring up Tim Powers this time.
No, I love Tim Powers. I love his books. He's a wonderful man and a good friend, and he's just. When you get into werewolves, you read the Anubis Gate. Yeah,
I have. Yeah, that's a fun book.
I think, that one and Declare might be my two favorites. But
yeah, I'm going to do an episode on Declare eventually, and that'll be really fun. That's such a good book. Oh my gosh. But okay, so and we can talk about Tim Powers, his take on vampires too. But so I want to talk about the. After the Enlightenment, you have this explosion of vampire hysteria, and it even goes so far as to be included in like official government reports of like the Habsburgs, where you have these officials, documenting vampire attacks, or what they think are vampire attacks. And I want you to talk about that because people have this notion that the Middle Ages were superstitious and bloodthirsty when. I mean, there's some truth to that, but it's not until after the Enlightenment that the witch hunting goes up by like 110% and the vampire hunting goes crazy. So, yeah, talk about that and like how that maybe impacted your A Bloody Habit.
Well, so it also made it into papal documents. The Pope there's a chapter where he says, "Stop digging up corpses and staking them. You must respect the dead bodies." So I think there were two things at work. One was that the dismissal of the supernatural and the preternatural, so many things that cannot be explained by empirical science, which require faith. The weirdness doesn't go away, right. But also, I think the reality of the fact that we are fallen, we are wounded, we carry concupiscence. Man himself is capable of being monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
You are just very rude. Yes, you are. Man himself is capable of being monstrous. But if you got this hyper-rational approach, what do you do with all of that? What do you do with all of that? Well, you become hysterical. There's a painting or a sketch by Goya, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, and it shows a man with his head down on a desk and monsters and goblins and ghoulies behind him.
Yeah.
So it's the counterpoint. There's also a painting by William Blake, by Isaac Newton, not
Okay.
Newman, wrong. And of Newton, and Newton is under the ocean, staring down at one precise point, and all of the beauty and richness and weirdness behind him is coming out of the darkness. And the implication is you're so focused, you've missed all of this.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it, that there's a consciousness of that this stuff still exists, the weirdness, the unexplained.
Mm-hmm.
And so because you've dismissed it and have given away all the tools to deal with it, you become, as I said, hysterical. That definitely happens to my narrator in Bloody Habit.
Yeah.
He loses his grip on reality a bit because a modern enlightened man who sees vampires must have lost his mind.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot to that. When all of society says these things can't exist, and they do, you feel like you're nuts because everybody else is like, no, that's not you can't believe that. So the only way to go is go crazy, and you don't have any outlet for the supernatural. You have no, like, through society and through the church, especially if you get rid of the Catholic Church in your country, like in England, or at least you persecute it heavily so that it's hardly there. Then that's why so many. I think that's why so many English people were involved and interested in the occult through like spiritualism and all of those things, like attending seances, and that's why I think you have that, because they have no other way to deal with the supernatural other than through these kind of back alley means. And you look
at even the rise of something like detective fiction. How many times in the detective fiction, the classic detective fiction heritage? Yes, you need to go back to sleep. Okay. How many times do you have a seance or the suggestion of something otherworldly that has to be explained away by the transcendent detective? It's sort of the irony of the fact that Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes, was not only a lapsed Catholic, but deeply involved in the occult later in life.
Yeah.
The man did honestly believe in that fairies could be captured on camera.
Yep.
I mean, he went off the deep end.
To be fair to him, a lot of people believed that when that was the fairy hoax.
Absolutely.
A lot of people believed in that.
A lot of those occult hoaxes that happened at the time, and there were more than one. It was because of this fascination and this feeling that cameras can't lie because they're scientific.
Right.
By the way, it doesn't come out in Dracula, but in his notes, Stoker wrote that if a photo were taken of Dracula, he would think that all would be visible would be the skeleton.
Oh, okay.
That's his theory.
Huh.
You just have a skeleton on the photo.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I almost don't blame. Well, I almost don't blame Conan Doyle. I almost don't blame these guys because they're looking for something that they don't have, right? So they're looking for the supernatural explanations for things that they know are there, but they look for them in the wrong places because they've already he's a lapsed Catholic, so he already kind of shut off that, that avenue of grace and safe supernatural, quote unquote safe. I use that term very loosely. So I almost don't blame him because he wants something else to be true, and so he falls into these hoaxes and he attends. He does all these bad things that nobody should do, like attend seances and be heavily involved in spiritualism, which is really ironic because it's a testament to his writing ability because Sherlock Holmes is the ultimate rationalist, and so to have a character like that produced by someone like Doyle, I mean, he's a good writer.
And Doyle even wanted his spiritualistic writing to be more important. It really hurt him that Sherlock Holmes was decidedly more popular than spiritualism. But no, I absolutely agree, and I think it's a testament to the fact that man yearns for God in spite of everything that man can do to put up barriers.
Right. Yeah.
And it's actually why one of my editors at Chrism Press, Karen Yulo, who's also written a vampire novel.
I have read that too. Mm-hmm.
Which is phenomenal. Jennifer the Damned.
Yep.
She actually handles a teenage vampire. But she said that it's one of the reasons why the Gothic and sci-fi fantasy is one of those realms where Catholics can be writing and be read by non-Catholics.
Yep. Because
your readers in that realm, they're already willingly suspending disbelief to read a fantasy vampire, whatever it is, novel.
Right.
So they're actually not close. They're not close to the reality of the Catholic Church because they're already accepting vampires.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's exactly why I wanted to start this podcast. That reason right there, because people like Tim Powers are read by a lot of secular people. Hardly any Catholics know he exists, Same thing with people like Gene Wolfe and Ari Lafferty. Like, these guys are read primarily by secular people, and not Catholics don't tend to even know that these phenomenal writers are even a thing. Like, where are the Catholic writers? Like, well, they're right here.
Catholics, this is why I'm glad for your podcast and people who are interested in this, because there is a little bit of a resistance on the part of the Catholics. And I felt this when Bloody Habit first came out.
Yeah.
The non-Catholics sort of look askance at the Catholics, right?
Yeah.
In the book. The Catholics are going, vampires? No, this must be demonic. It's no. I mean, I teach Dracula to Catholic high schoolers.
Right.
I teach the Gothic, and I think it's extremely valuable for students because it can convey so much about the dangers of evil,
right?
The true dangers of evil, but it also conveys something about goodness,
right?
The potential for goodness in man, God's desire for happiness for His creation.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gothic novel, the desire is for some form of redemption.
Right.
Whether the protagonist gets that redemption or not, the desire is there. And I mean, you see this in Tim Powers' novels.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they get redemption is they are deeply flawed, doing good things, but deeply flawed.
Yep.
So what does he do? He beats the snot out of them.
Yeah, he mutilates them. And they come out the other side, and they're stronger for it, but they still bear the marks of their trauma, their adventure.
And it's that if your arm causes you to sin, Tim Powers might literally chop it off.
He'll cut it off. Yeah. So that brings me to another point. So horror fiction gets kind of a bad reputation, and what you kind of touched on it, but the utility of horror fiction, like why is this actually probably one of the last places where you can get true evil, fighting good, this classic good versus evil that you don't get in like literary fiction, you don't get in even like, science fiction generally, but in horror fiction you get this, I think Tim Powers calls monsters literalized metaphors. I think that's what he calls them. So you get these like literalized metaphors, and they're evil, right? They're really evil, and then you have to defeat them. But usually in like horror, it has to be, well, if they're good, it has to be through, I don't know. Usually it's through Christian means if they're pulling on the folklore, because the folklore is heavily invested in Christianity, Christianity is heavily in folklore.
I think it is, like you said, the fact, the presence, the acknowledgement of good and evil. One of the dangers in modern horror is that they've given away the heart of it, and so now it becomes, as you said, misunderstood or justified. vampire or the monster is the transgressive outsider who really would be the hero, except we're just too close-minded.
Right. If it wasn't for society and our bigoted ways,
Exactly. But in classic Gothic, the tradition there is, and it's that there is good, there is evil. Good is stronger than evil.
Mm-hmm.
That's another critical point. Stoker sort of dances around it. He's a little bit inclined towards Manichaeism, but in the end, he's like, no, but good is better.
Yeah.
Good is stronger. It is. I just didn't really get into that.
Yeah. I mean, for the sake of drama, I think he might be dancing around that because it's more dramatic when you think that evil might win, right? I mean, even though it doesn't in the end, for the sake of the drama of the story, it kind of has to. The hero has to be on the ropes, for a little while.
Yeah, definitely. But if you've given away the possibility of ultimate good, which so many, they're no longer domestic comedies; they're angsty, self-reflective. I don't know. Oh gosh, I have a hard time stomaching a lot of contemporary fiction today.
Yeah.
But if you give that away, it just becomes an experience of navel gazing, not gazing outward, so that, when you gaze inward, it's only because of what you've seen outward to enhance your introspection. It's just sort of constantly gazing at the self, justifying the self. It's
annoying. Probably demonic, evil, but annoying mostly.
Well, and you imagine the inner life of Satan must be really boring.
Yeah. Yeah, he's constantly turning in, like he's constantly looking at himself in the mirror, But yeah, and when you take away like the possibility of damnation or redemption from horror, which is kind of like the crux of what horror is, then all you get is like nihilism. That's kind of what you end up with. Is I watched a movie called Oculus, and I liked it a lot until the ending. It's just with this like haunted mirror that like makes people go crazy. And in the end, the monster wins. In the end, the heroes try their best to defeat the monster, but the monster wins. And I'm like, that is a bunch of crap, man. Like that's. Like now I'm terrified, and the monster won. Like that's no, you can't. The monster can't win. It's like rule number one of horror fiction, unless you're writing a tragedy or something, then it's no longer horror.
It's because when you lose the cross, the suffering, the endeavor, the entire redemptive narrative is gone. It's sort of like when I teach Jane Eyre to students, I always say, what's the trajectory? The trajectory is the wedding feast of the Lamb. That's what she wants. Let's talk about the faith and understanding of Charlotte Bronte. She's a mess, and a fascinating mess. But she wants, and this in Christian understanding is the goal, is that you are brought through suffering and turmoil to happiness. In a Jane Austen novel, that's represented by marriage to a really desirable and financially secure and socially established hero.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what is represented there. It's just following the trajectory of eternity. So if you have a novel where the monster wins, you have to have had a sense that this is not what is desired and that it should not be. If you don't have that, you're going to have like you said, it'll be nihilistic. And if you if you have it and you have a sense that this should not be, I mean, we could say potentially the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But it isn't that good shouldn't have won.
Right.
If that makes sense. But if it's just sort of, this time the bad guys win. Next time maybe the good guys will win. It's also bad storytelling.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, everybody wants the good guys to win. That's just, there's something in us, because the good does win, so there's something in us that wants that to happen, and if you don't get it in a story, I mean, a tragedy is one thing, I mean, but if you don't get that in most stories, you're going to be unsatisfied. So vampire is Antichrist. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, he's the anti-Eucharist, he's the Antichrist. In Stoker's understanding, and I think it's one of the reasons the book is so compelling.
Yeah.
Is because he works all that in. So, of course, Bram Stoker was a Protestant Irishman whose wife eventually converted to Catholicism, and she was the first love of Oscar Wilde, who converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. There's a lot of Catholicism going around here, and because he's an Irishman, you just don't feel like he has the British hang-ups about Catholicism. Bram Stoker goes, well, let's throw all this stuff in.
Yeah, this is cool.
But he's not as anxious. His characters are anxious.
Yeah.
His British characters are anxious. So he works in really beautifully articulated. Early on, when Jonathan Harker's approaching Dracula's castle, the description sounds like the Garden of Eden, but corruption.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting imagery there. When you get to probably my favorite character, Renfield, and he is a zoophagous. He eats everything.
Yeah,
and he's to consume life. And the blood is the life, right? But he doesn't want soul. So he eats, first it's flies, then spiders.
Yep.
Doesn't he eat a bird?
Well, he feeds the flies to the spiders, and he feeds the spiders to the birds, and then he wanted to feed the birds to a cat. But the doctor said, no, because he's in the psych ward, he's in the lunatic asylum. And the doctor's like, no, I'm not going to give you a cat. And he's like, well, fine. Then he just ate all his birds. He had like 18 birds, and he just ate them all,
It's just gross. But the imagery that's used with him is so fascinating. The desire to consume life. The blood is the life. The blood is the life. And the doctor compares him to, is it Enoch? He walks with God, and he desires the loaves and fishes when he is in a real presence. Yeah. So it's this. Renfield himself is such a mess. But he's articulating the Eucharistic heart of the novel, the desire for the sacrament, and the danger of mistaking Dracula for the sacrament. Fascinating character, usually not represented. Like I said, possibly my favorite. Yeah. But Dracula. So Dracula, think about the ways that he takes the image of Christ and flips that understanding on its head. So Christ willingly sacrifices himself. Dracula appropriates victims who are not willing.
Right. Yeah.
Not giving himself, he's taking. Right. Dracula takes life, Christ gives life. The blood of Christ is poured out for the redemption of man. Dracula is sucking blood, and if he can, damning the people blood he's acquiring.
Well, one thing I came across yesterday was when you dig up the grave of a vampire, you can tell, quote unquote, it's a vampire because their corpse won't have decayed. And that kind of mirrors, it's like a weird funhouse mirror of like the incorruptible saints, where the body, won't have decayed. And sometimes, I think in the incorruptible saints, sometimes their hair and nails continue to grow. Is that, I don't know if that's right, but yeah, so it's like, it's kind of aping that, it's really fascinating.
Well, and when I first wrote the very first chapter of A Bloody Habit, I was on retreat with some Dominican nuns and shared a meal with a theologian named Father Thomas Joseph White, and chatted with him. He told me to take a nap because I was on retreat, right? On retreat, take a nap. Mm-hmm. But when I lay down to take a nap, I don't nap. I don't, but I'm obedient. Or trying to. And I looked up, and on the wall they had an icon, the icon not made by hands, the image of Veronica's veil. Mm-hmm. And I thought, it looks like a disembodied head floating on a background. And the last thought I had before I fell asleep was, because I've been working on Dracula and some other subjects, I went, Catholics would be so much better at fighting the preternatural because we're weirder. Yeah. And then I fell asleep and had a nightmare and wrote the first chapter of Bloody Habit. Awesome. But it's true, that weirdness. I mean, how many heads of St. Catherine of Siena are enshrined in churches? I know. Yeah, they chopped her up and sent her all over the world. It's just crazy. Here's the finger of Saint so-and-so. And, and it's beautiful, and it's efficacious, and we see these as signs, the sacramentals as signs. But it's still a dead body. It is, and... You can't get around that, it's weird. Well, my second is now preparing for First Communion, and we were discussing yesterday, why do you think that Jesus came to you in the form of bread and wine?
Mm-hmm.
Why? And our eldest, who's 9, went, because if it looks like a finger, we wouldn't eat it.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good reason.
So God sacramentally understands he wants to come to us. He wants to be intimate with us. But he also knows the weird factor and the gag factor. Mm-hmm. This was also after our eldest stumbled on descriptions of Aztec practices in a book about Our Lady of Guadalupe. That was a very conversation. Being a Catholic or just being a parent, there are so many things that you unpack with children that you say, oh, yes. Like when my husband explained what vampires were. Yeah. I would like it to go down in history that as a vampire novelist, I avoided answering that question.
My son asked me, he's upset. My son he loves Halloween. He's only 4. And so we've been trying to, get him spooky stuff, like kid-friendly stuff. But he asked me, are vampires real? And I didn't know how to answer him. I'm like, I don't know.
Well, actually, I did have to answer that question because the children came in with these huge eyes. Daddy just told us, we were reading the alphabet book about the V book, and I said, oh no. Daddy told us what vampires are. I said, well, what did he say? He said they're demonic creatures that come in the window at night and suck our blood while we're sleeping. I was like, well, that's pretty much covering everything. I guess he's sleeping in your room forever. But I said, look, Satan, of course, is real, and the devils are evil, and they want to destroy you. They love you. They think of you the way that we think of. However, the angelic powers are more powerful.
Yeah.
You are baptized. You are, this house is blessed. You have your guardian angel. This is how we pray to our guardian angels.
Right.
This is what we do so that you feel safe and secure. Usually, Satan does not manifest himself in the form of vampiric assault because he doesn't have to.
Right.
He can tempt you to hit your brother and get you to sin.
Right.
So much more easily. And if he shows up, and we haven't, I didn't get into exorcisms with him, but if you get to the exorcism scale, you might actually, like with John Kemp, provoke someone into thinking that God exists. Wouldn't you rather just let man destroy himself by lapsing into very petty, boring sin?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I've told my son, Christ, don't worry, Christ. There are no vampires in this country. Christ, we wiped them all out. It's fine. Christ won. It's okay.
You can also say, some of the things. Well, I haven't told my children this. Ways to ward off a vampire: clean your room. No, I'm joking.
Clean your room. Yeah. I mean, we have holy water everywhere in our house. My kids are always blessing things with holy water, and but there is
St. Benedict medals, and although the ones that are funny. I don't know if you caught this in Bloody Habit. There's a pile of seeds by a window at one point. That's actually part of folklore.
Yeah, I came across that. Yeah, they have to count it. They're compelled to count like sugar, rice, sand. They have to count each grain, and that's a fairy trope as well. Like fairies also have to do that. They're compelled to do it. And I'm like, there's a connection there. Like, what the heck's going on with this? Like, that's.
I think my theory is, and I mean, this is just my theory, which I tossed around with that artist friend of mine, Matt Alderman. In the end, I think it has to do with the demonic's lack of power over the natural world. The devil can create nothing new, right?
Yeah.
But he wants to pretend that in whatever form the preternatural appears, wants to pretend to have power.
Yeah.
If you have power, you need to be able, God knows every grain of sand on the sea and every hair on our head.
Right.
Well, that there even has to stop and count him.
Right. Yeah, he has no power over it. He's compelled to count it. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And then the other part of lore where they cannot enter into a house unless invited, which also kind of mirrors Satan. He can't affect you unless you invite him in to your heart, unless you invite him in. Yeah, so it's really, really fascinating. That's why, in movies and stuff like that, the vampires have to like trick you into coming outside or trick you into inviting them in the house. And then Tim Powers' Hide Me Among the Graves. And I want to talk about this in another podcast. But the vampire that shows up, the creature, looks very pitiable in the beginning. He looks like this stunted, sad looking, almost like a child. And the main character, Gabriel, no, what's her name? One of the Rossettis. Elizabeth? No, that's not it.
It's Christina Rossetti.
Yeah, thank you. Christina Rossetti. She not only she pities him, and not only invites him into her home, but into her bed. And spoilers, I guess.
What happens? That's like the first chapter. So
and it's not this. It's the big reveal is later when the implications of that come back to haunt her. And I want someone to write a paper on how Tim Powers uses pity and how Tolkien uses pity. For Tolkien, pity is redemptive because you're pitying like a humanish kind of creature like Gollum. Whereas in Tim Powers, if you pity the demonic, that's what they want. They want you to think that they're the downtrodden, and you can't pity the demonic.
Which takes us straight back to one very important component in all of this that I failed to mention, which is the romantic misreading of Paradise Lost. John Milton's Paradise Lost, an incredible poem.
Yeah.
An incredible poem, very much expressive of Milton's spirituality. It's absolutely beautiful, but of course highly flawed.
Puritan.
The Romantics looked at that and deliberately misread it so that Satan was the hero.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas I think Milton meant Satan to be insane when he wrote, Satan was supposed to be like insane, like defying God. Like that's an insane thing to do. But then the Romantics read that like, oh, he's the downtrodden, misunderstood hero. And that's how we get shows like Lucifer by Neil. That's why I don't like Neil Gaiman very much. That's why we get shows like Lucifer, like from Neil Gaiman. Like, oh, he's just misunderstood. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want, And so I'm like, oh, come on, man. Like,
and backstories of Dracula that try to make him, as we said, misunderstood.
Yeah.
So even further, they noted that that Satan in Paradise Lost has the best speeches.
Yeah.
But they didn't calculate for the fact that Milton, of course, would have distrusted this. He hated the papists too. I mean, there were a lot of people Milton hated.
Right.
So for him, it's the personification of evil that Satan is charismatic and the master tempter, and that God is really boring. Not really, but you know what I mean. The contract. But then William Blake said the reason that Milton wrote in chains when he wrote about God, but unfettered when he wrote about Satan, something like that, is because he was of the devil's party.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not, of course, what's going on. And then the Romantics take that up with Blake. Yeah. And then Shelley goes and says, well, actually, I don't even like Satan because this is too religious. Prometheus is the hero because he's defying the gods.
Right.
He is taking the fire of poetic whatever.
Yeah.
Shelley was nuts. I hope Shelley made it to heaven, but if he did, I'm going to kick him in the shins.
Percy Shelley you're talking about?
I do not like Percy Shelley.
Oh, Percy Shelley is what a horrible man. Like, and that poor Mary Shelley. Like, honestly.
He was a genius.
Yeah.
And he needs to be kicked in the shins.
Well, if Tim Powers is to be believed, it's because he was haunted by the Nephilim, the vampiric Nephilim that were driving him crazy.
Exactly.
And
well, you can see, he probably opened that door now given to you.
Yeah, it's his fault. No. I mean, I like what Tim Powers does with the Romantics. It's really interesting. I'm wondering, another theory about where vampires come from, is a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse, and that's or like suicide victims, so things like that, where it's something to do with they died probably in a state of mortal sin. That's kind of the implication, and then that kind of leaves their body open to possession, which is really that's just horrifying.
And it's also anxiety about their body, like you said.
Yeah.
And the question of what happens after death, notice that the vampire is dead. The undead means an unnatural intervention in the already unnatural course of things because of original sin that we die. We're not meant to die.
Right.
Of course, the separation of the soul and the body is the ultimate disorder because the person is the integrated body and soul. So when you break that, and then there, in the vampiric understanding, there is then an intervention that is further unnatural. It's like a suspension of that unnatural force of body and soul. That's very much the material for terror.
Right. Yeah, definitely. What's your favorite depiction of vampires other than Dracula and your own book in movies or in books? You can't say Dracula.
Ooh, that just got really, really hard. What is my favorite? I probably would say I'm probably going to take a cheap shot and say Tim Powers, either in Stress of a Regard, which has a vampiric element, or Hide Me Among the Graves. Either one. Mm-hmm. Both are evil, but I mean, there are so many really, really good ones. Yeah. It's even fun. I do recommend to listeners to go back and read Polidori's The Vampire. It's over the top. It's really bad, and you understand why Polidori, Lord Byron might have fired Polidori after. Polidori was Byron's private physician. Yeah. And possibly used his money. But Byron fired him. Polidori had this story that he'd written at the same time that Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein.
Yeah, they wrote it the same weekend, right? When they were at the was it Shelley's retreat house or like?
It was Byron's on Lake Geneva, and they were all together there. And Shelley had a nightmare, probably brought on by drugs. This was about a disembodied, bloody female head, and they said, "Hey, let's write ghost stories."
Well, drugs are a gateway to the spiritual world. I'm convinced of that. So I would,
and to the demonic.
Well, I mean the demonic. Yeah, you're not going to get any encounters with good angels on psychedelic drugs. That's for sure.
That is true. But I think actually, and this can be a final point, one that hopefully we'll look forward to Sunday. We can come back and talk about werewolves. Yeah. Is that the thing that there are so many things that open you up to evil in our fallen state. Mm-hmm. And recognizing a tendency towards vampirism, like an addiction to drugs or alcohol, like a predisposition towards lycanthropy, that you can become a werewolf. These are just concupiscence in technicolor. The reason that the Gothic and the depiction of the monstrous really is compelling for us is because we live with ourselves, and we know that without grace, we are monstrous, and our predominant sins might not be in technicolor, but they're still there, and they still can breed corruption, which is why we need grace.
Yeah, that's great. I have two final questions. They're both goofy, so bear with me. One, do vampires exist? Do you believe in vampires as an actual fact?
Actual vampires who are going to suck your blood, I think it's very unlikely. Okay. Unless the devil chooses to do that, but I think it's very unlikely.
Okay, well, sounds good.
I'm also an exorcist, and I get as close to it as is required so that I can make sure that all of my ideas and my novels are in sync with what is. Yeah. And I don't get any closer because it's not my job and I have to sleep.
Yep, makes sense. And then the final question. My podcast is called I Might Believe in Fairies. Now, I don't know if they exist. That's why I call it I Might Believe in Fairies. I had one person on who was convinced they're real, and I talked to her about it. But do you believe in fairies?
Properly speaking, meaning little flying, no. However, I do believe in degrees of the preternatural, which is why I say probably not for vampires, probably not for fairies. But there are things that defy reason and that are a result of this division between the supernatural and where we are. So in this natural fallen world. Mm-hmm. So I will say if I saw evidence of something along those lines, I would call for a priest and a psychiatrist. But
if you want to save time, hopefully they're the same thing.
Yes, exactly. I would, get me to some confession and a minor exorcism. Yeah. But, so I'm not expecting to go out into the fields and witness a fairy.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I just think it's fun to ask that. They're really goofy questions, but I think it's fun. Well, this has been really fun. And you have a new book out called Brother Wolf. And if you just for like a couple minutes, tell us about that.
So it's in the same sort of fictional universe as A Bloody Habit. My Dominican vampire slayers are back, and yes, I justify their existence in the werewolf novel. Werewolves in my fictional universe are rehabilitated by Franciscans. But in this particular book, I have a young heroine. For all those people who said I didn't give enough time to female voices in Bloody Habit, well, guess what? I've got a female narrator, and I love her. She's the daughter of a modernist scholar whose entire life, he's a former priest, his entire life has been dedicated to undermining, dismissing, explaining away all myth, all enchantment, and definitely the supernatural.
Yeah.
Sacramental, all of it. He threw it out. So she's been raised in a disenchanted world.
Mm-hmm.
And then she, on a ship, on her way home from the United States, she encounters this crew, including a Dominican nun. They are on the hunt for a relapsed werewolf. And she becomes so fascinated with this, has to unpack her father's conflicted relationship with Catholicism, becomes embroiled in the werewolf hunt. Can we find the werewolf before the werewolf actually damns his own soul by completing his lycanthropic descent?
Yeah.
And the particular situation with which she's becoming embroiled is twins. They're twins.
Mm-hmm.
The sister is in a convent. The brother was a werewolf who ended up with the Franciscans. And 10 years ago, they turned from a life of involvement in the occult, and now he has relapsed. So his sister comes out of the convent, track him down.
That sounds
and
great.
Athena tags along.
I might go buy that right now.
Herself in a lot of trouble.
That sounds fantastic. Great. And you wrote like an annotated edition of Dracula through Ignatius Press. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I've worked on several of the Ignatius critical editions.
Yeah, that's what it is. Thank you.
Dracula. So.
Yeah. So everybody go buy those books. They're really fun. And yeah, that's all I have. Do you have anything else to add about vampires, werewolves, spooky stuff?
One thing. I will give you all one last piece of valuable information. A stake doesn't kill. It's meant to immobilize the vampire and keep the vampire in place so that you can actually dispatch it. But every time you see in a movie or read in a book, someone staking a vampire and the vampire dies, that vampire is not dead.
That's pro-vampire propaganda. That's what they want you to think.
Exactly. In my classes, when I teach Dracula, at the end, we come up with a list of things that they feel Dracula should have done differently to have a better tactics, because his strategy is really bad.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to England and I'm going to pray one at a time on people who know each other. Bad idea.
Yeah, and you deal with that in A Bloody Habit, too. You have a better plan for the vampire master.
That was one of the things I had to do in Bloody Habit. But I also say, how can you battle the vampire? I've had kids come up with ideas like garlic shampoo.
Yeah, that makes sense. You'd smell bad, but in any case,
make sure that you have something else in addition to your steak, preferably a rosary.
Right. You're supposed to decapitate them, right? You're supposed to decapitate them after you stake them. And according to Wikipedia, aspen is commonly used because apparently, according to legend, that's the wood that was used for Christ's cross. And so aspen, I mean, you can use oak. I mean, there's all other traditions, but that was particularly interesting to me. It was I always heard it was oak. That was the wood used for Christ's cross, but apparently it's aspen. I don't know.
Well, it also depends which country you're coming from, but there's always because Christ's cross part.
Yeah.
In Christianized folklore, and one last thing on the description of you cut off the head, stuff a mouthful of garlic. When you're reading Dracula, so many moments sound like he's about to give you a recipe. It's like sprinkle some paprika and roast the vampire at 350 for an hour. So there's a lot of flavor in Dracula too, which is hilarious. Don't bake these at home, kids, but
yeah. And I love how Dracula is also like basically just journal entries and news articles of it makes it seem real. Like the news article of the storm when the Dracula ship's coming in and like everybody's dead on board. It's really because now this is just a tangent, but this is fun. So like the newspaper guy who's like interviewing people, it goes from a very professional like newspaper, I'm just reporting the news, to like this poetic, like dark, like the storms were raging and the sea was a monster, and then it goes back to, and then I talked to this sailor who said, it's really.
Well, and it's actually one of those things that you do in the middle of preternatural threat is, but look, we are proceeding on a very scientific methodology, right. And we have evidence. See, here's the evidence.
Right.
Just wait for the scene when Dracula finds their dossier. He finds the evidence.
Uh-oh.
And what Dracula does with the evidence.
Okay, sounds good. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and I really want to talk about werewolves next time. But yeah, I have to read that book, and then I have to research werewolves. And I did not do either of those things for this podcast, so... everybody go out and buy Eleanor Bourg Nicholson's books. They're really fun. And then go and read Dracula for Halloween. That's what I'm doing. And I recommend it. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming on my show.
Thank you for having me. Have a great Halloween.
Yeah, you too. Happy Halloween. Thank you for listening to this episode of I Might Believe in Fairies. Please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow me on Twitter at Aaron Erber and like me on Facebook. If you're excited to see where the podcast is going and want to offer some support for the project, you can find me on Patreon. Music is by Alexander Nakarada, and podcast art was designed by my wonderful sister-in-law, Linnea Kisby. Until next time, talk to you soon.